Hello, I'm Jonathan Lear, the Roman Family Director of the Neubauer Collegium for Culture and Society. Thank you. Can you hear me now? Yes. Good. I first heard of J.M. Coetzee in the early 1980s when a friend gave me a copy of Waiting for the Barbarians, which had recently come out. I do not think it a retrospective fantasy to say that I can remember the experience of first reading it. I was shocked and taken aback and pulled in. I felt I was in the presence of truth. Not truth in the sense of getting the facts right, but truth in the sense of getting to the essence of the thing, getting to the bottom of something, of ringing true. It was menacing. It seemed to me that the author must have suffered to put this image of evil into words. The author wanted to know how evil works in the human soul, how some can know and not know that they are participating in it, and others can wholeheartedly embrace it. His was not merely a theoretical quest, but a quest for practical and emotional understanding. And he wanted, at least as I was a reader, he wanted to communicate that understanding to his readers. And reading the book puts pressure on one's ability to tolerate truth. In the case of evil, getting to the bottom of things means coming to recognize that there is no bottom. The book had historical specificity. In some sense, it was about apartheid. But it captured a fearful fantasy about others that, unfortunately for us, seems to be timeless and contagious. Throughout the country today and in countries all over the world, we are waiting for the barbarians. And we regularly assume not only that the others are barbarians, but that it is others who are waiting. Now, I've read this book repeatedly over decades, and my first experience has only been reinforced. This is a classic. Now, in the mid-1990s, thanks to the brilliant chairmanly work of Robert Pippin, John Coetzee joined the Committee on Social Thought. And I would like to share with you two impressions of meeting him because they are so at odds with the public image. First, I have rarely met someone so open, so welcoming, so ready to talk, so generous, yet shrewd, blunt, honest, and to the point, yet ready to have a good laugh. Our friendship was effortless. Second, I have rarely met someone so open, so welcoming, so ready to talk, so generous, and so committed to students. Teaching for him was an affair of the heart, and as well as an ethical commitment. So how could it be that John is publicly inscribed as reclusive? I have come to think that the situation is simple, a false image that is a distortion of something true. John knows what we ourselves already know, only he knows it better, that we are alive for a while. He bears better than most the knowledge that we're going to be dead for a long time. And though I don't want to identify him with any of his characters, I believe that he, like Elizabeth Costello, has a sympathetic imagination that can extend so far as to know what it is like, that is, to experience being dead, extinct, no longer capable of experience. His life is an extraordinarily crafted answer to the question, what are we going to do while alive? He wants to understand how things are, what we humans are like, what animals are like, what numbers and mountains are like, music, spirits, and children, what are they like? And what ethical commitments follow from all of that? His life is a witness to what he has learned in learning, a life in literature and literary criticism that shines out to its readers and pulls us in with all its light and dark, the intensity of a series, I think, of Rembrandt's self-portraits. I think the comparison to Rembrandt is apt for disciplining a craft to express an understanding of life and death. I think this understanding provides a key to the false public image. John is not reclusive, but he is impatient with living in cliches, quite literally impatient. He doesn't have time for it. And thus, he does turn away from hollowed-out rituals that themselves turn us away from our inbuilt awareness of life and its preciousness. And this reluctance to participate in distractions has itself been transformed into some kind of fake news, the cliché of being reclusive. And I suppose he is also cliché's enemy. Cliché and fashion provide a route by which we pretend to ourselves that we know what we don't know, and when it comes to evil, that we do not know what we do know. Now, when one thinks of authors who have influenced Coetzee, one regularly thinks of Defoe, Dostoevsky, and Kafka. I also think of Plato, whom I suspect lies at the heart of it all. Now, when it comes to clichés, the great author coming to campus is one that's pretty difficult to avoid. And, please pity the hapless academic to whom the task falls to give an introduction. Is there anything more constrained and overly familiar than an academic introduction? And I am confident in this that you can rely on your own experience, but you can also find 2 excruciating accounts of this in John's book, Elizabeth Costello. Now, my perhaps temporary solution is to think that my job is not to introduce John, but to welcome him back. And for me, this is a complex and emotionally demanding task. On the one hand, there is the joy of remembering those years of teaching Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Proust and Plato together in the company of students and colleagues. In those days, I felt there was no gap between what we were doing and what we ought to be doing. But on the other hand, in remembering, there is the recognition that I am remembering that that time is over. And in the joy of welcoming him back, I also recognize that part of what it is to welcome him back is to acknowledge he left. And he left because he had other things, in his eyes, better things to do. I embrace his decision. Indeed, I think it was a good decision. And our friendship has survived and deepened and taken its own route. But I can assure you that this moment is anything but a cliché for me. John, thank you for making the arduous trip to come back and spend some time with us. Thank you for being willing to share your thoughts with us. And colleagues and friends, please join me in welcoming John Coetzee back to our community.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for those words. What I will be presenting today is an essay in autobiography, specifically an essay on my formation between the ages of about 3 and 10, under the influence of reading and rereading a children's book that was popular during my day, the Childrens Encyclopedia. Now, I take it as uncontested that the books we read as children, at least some of them, leave an impression on us, and that this impression goes deeper than the impression left by books we read as adults. Whether the impression left by our childhood reading is abiding, or whether, on the contrary, we routinely outgrow it and throw it off, is a separate question. Without empirical evidence one way or the other, I tend to believe the former claim, in fact, a strong version of it, that we are marked by our early reading, that the mark may be formative of our character, but also that it may lie so deep as to be unavailable to scrutiny, at least by normal processes of introspection. Whether it may be recoverable by some alternative process, such as, for example, by psychoanalysis, is outside my purview today. When I was 3 years old, in the year 1943, my mother acquired a 10-volume set of the Children's Encyclopedia, second-hand, disposed of by a public library that was replacing it with a new updated edition. During the 1940s and 1950s, we carried these 10 hefty volumes with us on our wanderings around South Africa, and I'm going to ask Mark for the first illustration. Internal evidence suggests that what we had was the 1925 edition. Therefore, when I refer to views of the Children's Encyclopedia and its contributors, I mean those views as they stood in the early 1920s. As a family, we owned only a handful of books. The Children's Encyclopedia became my staple reading until the age of 9 or 10, when I joined a public library and began to devour stories of adventure. In fact, the Children's Encyclopedia was my staple reading even before I could read. There were plenty of mysterious pictures to pore over, and indeed some pages are marred by pencil scrawlings of my pre-literate self. It was also the staple resource of my mother. Whenever I nagged her, "I am bored, what can I do?" her standard response was, "Why don't you look at a green book?" A word now about the history of the Children's Encyclopedia. It was first published in 1910 in 8 volumes. It had a prehistory before 1910, which I won't go into. Then it was re-edited as a 10-volume set in 1923, and thereafter republished year after year with revisions and additions into the 1940s. In Britain and the British Empire, it sold over the years 1.5 million sets. US rights were acquired by the Lear Company, and under the title The Book of Knowledge, it sold a further 3.5 million sets in the United States. At one time, the Lear Company had 3 separate printing and binding plants devoted entirely to the production of the encyclopedia. It was adapted and translated into French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, and Chinese. The success of this very British and indeed very English book in the outside world is not easily explained. England is continually referred to as our motherland, and the vast preponderance of the lavish colour illustrations are of British flowers, British locomotives, famous British men, etc. Of the 7,000 odd pages of the 1925 edition, South Africa has 5 pages of text devoted to it, plus another 11 pages of maps and photographs. South African history is disposed of in a few sentences. The record of British imperialism in southern Africa, culminating in the Anglo-Boer War of 1899 to 1902, is blanked out. The Children's Encyclopedia was thus an odd source for a South African child, white or black, to depend on for an understanding of who he was and where he came from. Question: what was such an aggressively Anglo-centric book doing in Africa in one of Britain's ex-colonies? One answer is that the Children's Encyclopedia was simply a commodity among commodities, sold wherever it could be sold, in Africa or anywhere else, for the profit of Amalgamated Press in London. To Amalgamated Press, it did not matter, in a sense, what was in the Children's Encyclopedia, or why people bought the Children's Encyclopedia for their children, or what their children got out of it when they read it. It was enough that the Children's Encyclopedia sold well not only in South Africa and Australia and New Zealand and Canada, but also, as it turned out, in the United States. A better answer to the question is that in the colonies, the Children's Encyclopedia acted as an arm, a propaganda arm of British foreign policy. It gave an admirable, in fact, idealized picture of life back home, a picture which the colonies, as they evolved in the course of history, could follow and hope to emulate. For this claim to be true, it does not require overt collusion between Amalgamated Press and Her Majesty's Foreign Office, though it is true that Alfred Harmsworth was in due course elevated to the peerage as Viscount Northcliffe. I recall a conversation I had with an American diplomat in East Africa. The British have the British Council, the French have the Alliance Française. I said, how come you Americans don't have a cultural outreach agency? We have the movies, she replied. The problem was to grow up to be a model Englishman of the kind proposed by the Children's Encyclopedia. One had first to be an English child, a child of the English race. The Children's Encyclopedia did nothing to show a child from Bombay or Jamaica or Johannesburg how to achieve that first elementary step, how to become an English child. It could only advise the colonial on how to mimic an English child. For a child from Sydney, the picture may have been slightly different, in that the Australian child could tell himself he was just a geographically displaced English child. The English in South Africa, the people whom Afrikaners had no qualms about labeling English, called Engelse, but who fastidiously refer to themselves as English-speaking South Africans, these people had much the same advantage as the English in Australia. For such children, the Children's Encyclopedia could be regarded as a manual, a crash course on how to reclaim their birthright when they went back to England, their spiritual home or motherland. The figure of the imitation Englishman is common in Indian literature of the 20th century. The native-born Indian who affects British manners, British turns of phrase, a British upper-class accent. In Indian literature, this mimic man is a figure of fun. His alienation from his own community is treated as comic. In South African literature, the figure of the mimic Englishman is, as far as I know, absent. Did the Children's Encyclopedia alienate me from my community? To answer this question, I must first ask, what was my community? And to answer that question, I must move briefly from sociology to autobiography and say something about my personal and familial background. For the first 5 years of my life, the years 1940 to 1945, my father was absent from the household. He was away in North Africa and Italy, serving in the South African Armed Forces. Therefore, my brother and I were brought up solely by my mother, who, despite bearing my father's Afrikaans name, spoke very little Afrikaans. Why not? Because her own mother, having been born in the United States, in Illinois, arrived in South Africa at the age of 11, speaking English and German, but no Dutch. Although she married an Afrikaner, she looked down on Afrikaners in general and imposed English as the home language of her 6 children, including my mother. Thus, I was raised as a monolingual English speaker until the end of the war, when our family circumstances changed, and a sudden immersion among Afrikaans-speaking children allowed me to pick up Afrikaans in one of those miraculous feats of language learning that young children are capable of. Because of this background, I did not have a cultural community, that is, a linguistic and ethnic community, or as Arthur Mee, editor of the Children's Encyclopedia, would have put it, a race into which I slotted comfortably. Such a position, or non-position, was not uncommon in South Africa in the late 19th and 20th centuries, and helps to explain why a certain subset of whites prefer to call themselves English speakers rather than plain English. If I did not have an easily identifiable community, did my immersion in the Children's Encyclopedia nevertheless alienate me from the people around me? My answer: such a massive 10-volume propaganda onslaught at an impressionable age could not but leave a child with a deeply ambivalent attitude toward himself. The Children's Encyclopedia offered an evolutionary account of the world in which only one phylum was the correct, the predestined, the highest one. And all the rest, the ones that led to the duck-billed platypus, or the benighted aboriginal, or the rude Boer, were false trails. There was no alternative world picture to hand, no worldview that contradicted Arthur Mee's, not only because the Children's Encyclopedia and the attendant books that it roped into its imperial enterprise, the concise Oxford Dictionary of English, the complete plays of Shakespeare, were pretty much the only books in our house, but also because, back in 1943, there was no counter voice to the Children's Encyclopedia to be heard in South Africa, no authority to give the colonial child an alternative explanation of who he was and why he was there. So, from my colonial distance, I admired those unattainable golden English children as I was supposed to. At the same time, however, because I was not bereft of a sense of justice, I did not see why they, the English, should inherit the world while I was cut out. Therefore, my admiration was tinged with envy and resentment. I did not necessarily wish those golden English children well. Vis-à-vis the English, I found myself trapped in profound ambivalence. I spoke the language of the English. I would go on to read the books that constituted their literature. I would even make a career of it, ending my academic life as a professor of English at the University of Cape Town, an institution created by the British colonial administrators in 1829. But I never embraced the English language as my own, never read English authors except at a distance as foreigners speaking to me in their foreign voices. From those authors who were most stridently claimed to speak for England, Shakespeare at their head, I maintained a suspicious distance. On the other hand, when I read the verdict of the Children's Encyclopedia on Alexander Pope, that he tried to appear cleverer than he really was, that he was a sneak and vain almost to insanity, I could not wait to read Pope. Clever, I gradually learned, was a code word used by the English to disparage people while seeming to praise them. Byron was another poet damned for being clever. Benjamin Disraeli was identified as, I quote, the clever Jew who became prime minister, unquote. When I went to school, I was called a clever boy, which I naively took to be a commendation. It took me years to realize that cleverness was to the English not a virtue, that to receive a stamp of approval from Arthur Mee, one had to hide one's cleverness, not flaunt it. From here, I could continue in autobiographical vein to talk about my relations to Afrikaans literature, to American literature, to Australian literature, to say nothing of German and other non-English literatures, but there is no time for that. I want to talk about Arthur Mee. Who was Arthur Mee, whose shaping force over my own life I have come to recognize with some disquiet? A short answer is that Mee was an unexceptional, indeed colorless Englishman who was lucky enough to spot a new trend in educational theory, namely a move away from rote learning toward a concentration on the individual child and the child's developing needs. Mee spotted that trend and exploited it, becoming rich and modestly famous in the process. Unexceptional at a human level, Mee nevertheless acted as an armature through which England extended its reach into the souls of children far and wide, providing them with an ensemble of attitudes, values, and beliefs which could prove surprisingly hard to dislodge. Illustration 2, Arthur Mee. Arthur Henry Mee was born near the city of Nottingham in 1875. His father was a machine operator in a clothing factory, his mother a factory worker. Mee himself left school at the age of 14, taught himself shorthand and typing, and got a series of jobs on newspapers, which in due course took him to the Daily Mail in London, where he caught the eye of the newspaper's publisher, Alfred Harmsworth. Harmsworth put Mee to work editing The Harmsworth Self-Educator, subtitled A Golden Key to Success in Life, a magazine aimed at aspirational working and lower middle class readers to whom it promised a head start in the struggle for survival in the modern world. This magazine was a phenomenal success. It was followed in the year 1909 by a series called The World's Great Books, again edited by Arthur Mee. The World's Great Books did not sell well, in Mee's diagnosis, because reading great books, or summaries of them, did not yield demonstrable material rewards. Alert to the move among educators toward child-centered learning, Mee came up with a new idea, a magazine aimed at the children of the same demographic that had bought The Self-Educator. Surely, people who invested in their own self-advancement would be prepared to invest in the advancement of their children, he reasoned. Like The Self-Educator, the Children's Encyclopedia magazine came in thematic chapters covering religion, literature, art, science, history, geography, flora, fauna, and thought. Thought meant, in effect, lessons in practical morality, plus stories from all over the world, as well as sections entitled Things to Make and Things to Do. The text was liberally illustrated with drawings, diagrams, and photographs. In a series of chapters entitled Wonder, Mee offered answers to questions claimed to be closest to the hearts of children. He used the fiction that the questions came from his own young daughter, Marjorie. The actual writing of the encyclopedia was contracted art to an ensemble of contributors, some of them university-based, but most with no expert qualification other than a view of the world that me found congenial and experience in writing for children. As general editor, me ensured that they used simple, accessible English and generally stayed in line. The magazine was such a success that in 1910 the entire run was reissued in bound form as the new Children's Encyclopedia. In the burgeoning field of books for children, the name Arthur Mee was soon identifiable as a reliable brand, to be spoken in the same breath as Kenneth Grahame, James Barrie, A.A. Milne, Rudyard Kipling, or before them, Lewis Carroll. Mee's encyclopedia popularized and sentimentalized a view of childhood as a time of innocence and wonder. The first volume was ushered in with a color plate of quasi-angelic children in a paradise of flowers and tame animals. Illustration 3. Mother Nature and her children. Mee came from a nonconformist family. He believed, without doubt, in God, England, and the civilizing mission of the British Empire. His religion was non-denominational. He had no trouble in fitting Darwinian evolution into it. Evolution was one of the instruments that a non-denominational God used to bring about his inscrutable ends. In a cautious way, Mee believed in literature too. The literature bequeathed to us by great authors, though only within a certain narrow band. Of all authors, he revered Shakespeare most, a Shakespeare who, I quote, expressed the spirit of England and the English-speaking race, unquote. Mee devoted himself to transmitting his particular idealisms to generations of British children, a mission in which he was tirelessly active until his death in 1943. Though he lived through times of huge political and social upheaval, the mix he offered of cultural conservatism, expressed at times as strident patriotism, and Christian socialism, expressed sometimes in personal campaigns to alleviate poverty and destitution, never changed. To me, as a small child who could barely read, who did not know what an author was, and certainly could not tell the difference between an author and an editor, Arthur Mee, with his green books, was a kindly, perhaps even loving, quasi-paternal presence in the household. It was only around the age of 10 that it began to dawn on me that Arthur Mee's love was limited, that it was not all-embracing enough to include children like me, that to be loved by Arthur Mee, you had first to be winsome, which I was not. I was a surly child. And secondly, you had to be English, which again, I was not. Today, we would probably be suspicious about the motives of a man with such a strong fixation on small children. This is a road down which I do not intend to go. There was no scandal attached to Mee's name during his lifetime, therefore I will regard him as he wished to be regarded, namely as a man whose love of children was wholly benign. I want to talk now about race and empire. One of the first things that will strike a modern reader of the Children's Encyclopedia is its unambivalent and indeed enthusiastic embrace of European colonialism in general and British colonialism in particular. The British Empire is the greatest empire in history, we are repeatedly told, encompassing 1/4 of the world's population, something that every British child should be proud of. Pride in the British Empire as a force of progress goes hand in hand with an unquestioned and unquestioning racism. The British have been able to build the greatest of empires, says the encyclopedia, because the Anglo-Saxon race is the highest race. It is the historic duty of higher races, like the Anglo-Saxons, to bring the lower races out of darkness and set them on the road to enlightenment. A word of caution. In the Children's Encyclopedia and the era from which it came, the term race was used in a loose, even elastic way. The United Kingdom, for example, is inhabited by 4 races: the English, the Scots, the Welsh, and the Irish. Today, we might use the word community, where the Children's Encyclopedia uses race. But community, in today's speech, tends to be equally elastic and indeed evasive in its meaning. The Children's Encyclopedia not only uses the word race freely, but when required can invoke an entire science of race. Among the 14 persons listed as chief contributors to the encyclopedia is C.W. Saleeby, a medical doctor and proponent of eugenics, quite a public figure in his day. Chapters are never signed, but it is probable that Saleeby wrote the chapters in which the most nakedly racist views are expressed. Some instances follow. Instance 1. The Aboriginal people of Australia are, I quote, too backward either to help or to be in the way of progress. As a remnant of very early mankind, they are interesting to the student of human progress, but they are not a serious problem, unquote. Instance 2. The difference between a man like Newton or Darwin and the Eskimo or Papuan is almost inexpressible. Instance 3. In the forests of Africa, there are still savage men whose eyes are filled with the same perplexity which we see in the eyes of monkeys. Instance 4. Some parts of the earth are inhabited by a humble kind of men and women who do not merely know less than we do, but are not able to learn as much as we do, even when they get an equal chance. And we notice that these people do not have a high and broad and straight forehead as we do, but that their foreheads are long and narrow and slope sharply backwards. We have no more right to despise these people than we have to despise any other creature that God has made. But we must understand that they are less able to look after themselves and to protect themselves from evil things than we are, just because their brains are not as large as ours, and therefore a special duty falls on us, who have larger and better developed brains, to do the right thing to these people, the little backward races of the earth, end quote. In the encyclopedia's account of how the world came to be as it is, progress is the key concept, anchored in a Whig liberal historiography and in a reading of Darwin that interprets life as a progressive evolution from mollusk to European man. The study of history is thus a matter of locating and following the evolutionary progressive line through the mere welter of events. History is the story of progress, of how certain great ideas battle to establish themselves against the forces of ignorance or barbarism or darkness, and eventually, with a certain inevitability, because the Children's Encyclopedia is above all optimistic in its outlook, these ideas triumph. Chief among the great ideas that give shape to human history are the idea of a single, invisible God associated with Judaism, the idea of the equality of all human beings associated with Jesus, and the idea of truth given birth to in Athens and perpetuated in the questings of modern science. An optimistic belief in universal progress does not sit entirely easily with race theory. If the Aboriginal peoples of Australia are an evolutionary remnant of interest only to the anthropologist, if Africans have not fully left monkeyhood behind, does it matter if Africans are used as slaves or Aboriginal Australians encouraged to die out? To its credit, the Children's Encyclopedia expresses itself unequivocally in opposition to slavery and in favor of the upliftment of the lower races, which is taken to be part of the white man's burden. I now want to talk about sex. I have spoken thus far as though the Children's Encyclopedia were written for export. Far from it. The primary market was at home in England among the aspiring lower middle class and working class, the class from which Arthur Mee himself emerged. Salesmen of the encyclopedia targeted parents who could not afford private schools, but were anxious that their children should better themselves, much as Mee himself had done. Education offered the most reliable ladder by which to climb out of the class into which one was born. The child with the encyclopedia at home would have a head start over the child who had no one to rely on but his teachers. I take this to be the purpose behind my own mother's acquisition of the encyclopedia. She had no idea of the cultural and moral turmoil it would cause in her son. She merely wanted him to do well. The children for whom Arthur Mee wrote his book, if I was to believe the illustrations, were the fair-haired, blue-eyed youth of England. To the mature reader, it may be obvious that the picture of such golden children was simply part of the packaging of the Children's Encyclopedia. But the young reader can be forgiven for taking them to be Mee's personal followers across the ocean. Illustration 4. Fair-haired, blue-eyed, and, above all, sexy. Illustration 5. The illustrations follow the 1920s fashion, according to which the female has small breasts, narrow hips, long legs. She wears filmy clothing that clings to her thighs. Her tresses are tossed by the wind. She is so light that she seems to float. These exotic girl creatures peopled my erotic dreams from an early age. Figures of longing, one cannot yet call it desire, who were heartbreakingly unattainable, not only because they lived thousands of miles away in a mythic England, but also because they would never give a second thought, a second look at a mere colonial. I was an outsider, a lowly outsider, spying on the lives of these blessed golden children. I was able to spy on them because I could read their book in their language. Then, as I grew older, it became clear to me that I did not even have the right to their language. It was not my language, as it was their language by birthright, since no matter how far back I went in my ancestry, I could find no drop of English blood in my veins. As far as they, the golden children, were concerned, I was as much foreigner, alien, as the Eskimo or the Papuan. Until quite an advanced age, I never got to see a real-life naked girl. To find out what a naked girl looked like, I had to rely on the encyclopedia, on the handful of pictures it contained, paintings and photographs of statues from ancient times where most of the time there was some kind of drapery covering the girl's sex. Illustration 6. And illustration 7. Male statues presented an even more confounding problem. Illustration 8. Illustration 9. Illustration 10. How was the male child of 4 or 5 to understand these pictures of men without genitalia? Did one's genitals just drop off when one grew up? Did one have to cut them off? Illustration 11. Illustration 12. Illustration 13. Today, it is easy to recognize the prudery of Arthur Mee and his publishers and laugh at it. It was not only Greek statues that had to be cleaned up before they were admitted to the Children's Encyclopedia. The encyclopedia called upon the Arabian Nights for some of its stories, but only, the reader was reassured, after they had been, I quote, cleansed of their foulness by editing and alteration, unquote. One of the heroic figures from history held up for our admiration is Lucretia, who killed herself after being violated by Tarquin. But Shakespeare's long poem about her, The Rape of Lucrece, is simply retitled Lucrece. Joseph is tempted by Potiphar's wife, but tempted to do what? Answer, to do a dishonorable thing. Plato and Aristotle are commended for being great thinkers, but they come with a cryptic warning. I quote, even among the greatest of the Athenians' teachers, sin held an undisputed sway. Unquote. Sin. What sin exactly? In the index to the Children's Encyclopedia, there is no entry for sex, no entry for reproduction. In an otherwise informative chapter entitled Our Wonderful Glands, we learn about the salivary glands, the pituitary gland, the lymphatic glands, and so forth, but the testicles get no mention. In the chapter entitled Wonder, offering what are called plain answers to the questions of the children of the world, the question most frequently asked by the children of the world, where do babies come from, does not figure. No doubt the wholesale blanking out of sex was Mee's way of preserving the Edenic innocence of his golden-haired, blue-eyed children. But at least some of his childish readers, and not only in the colonies, must have been left wondering about the absences and the disappearances of which the genitals that were not there were only the mark or non-mark. What was all the secrecy about? What was it that dared not be uttered, dared not be looked at? I now want to talk about sacrifice. The last of the problem areas I want to identify in the encyclopedia is more difficult for me to talk about than race or sex, because I still feel myself to be within it. It is not just in my past, I can see its workings in my present too, though only dimly. It has to do with moral values and specifically with self-sacrifice. Here is a list of historical figures whom the Children's Encyclopedia lauds and holds up as a model to the growing child. Leonidas, who died defending Greece. Socrates, who who drank hemlock, Lucretia, who stabbed herself, Jesus, who died on the cross, Roland, who died at Roncesvalles, Jeanne d'Arc, who was burnt alive, Madame Roland, who died in the guillotine, Father Damien, who died of leprosy, Titus Oates, who went out to die in the cold of the Antarctic. All of these people chose self-sacrifice, meaning death, when they could have chosen life. They chose the hard road when they could have chosen the easy road. They died for the sake of others, and they did so without making a fuss about it. As the laconic Spartan Leonidas put it, "Stranger, take this message to the Spartans, that here we lie, obedient to their orders." Period. They died, and after they had died, everyone recognized what heroes they had been and was sorry, and eulogized them and wrote poems about them. The strategy being appealed to here is the strategy that Nietzsche in the Genealogy of Morals uncovered in the slave religion of Christianity. Announce a new inverted hierarchy in which the first shall be last and the last first, in which the meek shall end up as inheritors of the kingdom. The same strategy is invoked by the child who commits suicide so that his parents will feel guilty about the way they treated him. Expressed in this way, the Christian gospel is a variety of moral jiu-jitsu which is hard to respect. Why does Arthur Mee hold up Socrates or Jeanne d'Arc as a model to be imitated, as opposed to, say, Alexander the Great or Isaac Newton? Here is the most up-to-date hero put before us by Arthur Mee. His name is Jack Cornwall. And here is Jack's story in the words of the Children's Encyclopedia. John Travers Cornwall was first-class boy on the Chester, one of the British ships which fought in the Battle of Jutland in 1916. In the official dispatches describing that terrible contest, there was nothing to excel the story of the boy Cornwall, aged only 16 years. Within less than 5 minutes of the opening of the battle, Jack's gun was put out of action by an enemy shell, and at the same time he was wounded to death. But he remained steady at his post, waiting for orders. He felt he might be needed, so he stayed there, waiting under heavy fire, with just his own brave heart and God's help to support him. They bore him back to Grimsby, and there in the hospital, the nurse asked him how the battle had gone. "Oh, we carried on all right," he said simply. He said nothing of his own immortal deed. The little hero's body was buried at Manor Park Cemetery, but when the news of his heroism was published, he became a national hero. End of quote. The Children's Encyclopedia was put together in the years before and after the Great War of 1914-1918, a war to which Arthur Mee gave his wholehearted support. The task of the patriotic media, in the view of Mee and his journalistic colleagues, was to honor the dead, but also to appropriate their deaths, to prevent them from being used by defeatists or revolutionaries to tell an alternative anti-imperial story. For example, what a waste of young lives, and to what end? Along with millions of other child readers of the first post-war generation, remember I was reading a 1925 edition, I was being urged to stand ready for orders in case I should be needed, to lay down my life if necessary for the race, the empire, and to accept death uncomplainingly. In return, I was promised I would be admitted to the rank of heroes. Theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. There were two stories in the Children's Encyclopedia to which I returned again and again in my childhood reading. One was the story of Jack Cornwall, the other the story of the faithful dog Gellert. Gellert was put to death for killing his master's baby, only for it to be found afterwards that the baby was alive after all, Gellert having saved it from a wolf. So Gellert's master was very sorry and gave Gellert a special burial. As a child, these stories brought tears to my eyes. Even as I retell them today in a fairly mocking fashion, I can feel lurking within me a great involuntary heave, a flood of sentiment which I despise, but over which my rational self seems to have no control. I can call it what it is, a moral pathology, but that doesn't help. Arthur Mee still has me in his grip. Conclusion. As I said at the beginning, I embarked on this little project in autobiography in an effort to understand something about myself, about how I came to be the person I am. The Children's Encyclopedia, along with a lot of other children's literature of the era, exploited the sentiment of compassion in its young readers to what I now regard as an unconscionable degree. In a comparable way, it enveloped sex in mystification and shame, and taught a version of evolutionary development, and indeed of history, in which Anglo-Saxons emerge as God's chosen race. From the point of view of the 21st century, it is not difficult to put Arthur Mee in his place and see his encyclopedia for what it was, an ideological project of turn-of-the-century imperial Britain, a project which was, in fact, dealt a death blow by the First World War, yet which managed to go on selling its reassuringly optimistic vision of the future in an afterlife that extended well into the 1940s. Nor is it difficult to denounce its prudery, its racism, and its shameless appeals to patriotism. The question remains, however, whether a rejection of early childhood influences, which takes place only at an analytical, intellectual level, has the power to eliminate those influences and wash them away as if they had never existed. I have my doubts. Thank you.
So I've asked two of our colleagues to come up and start the conversation going. John has agreed to have a conversation, and Allison James and Matt Boyle. Allison is in the Romance Languages Department professor, and Matt Boyle is in the Philosophy Department. And given that England had such a large part of the talk, Allison, why don't we start with you?
Well, thank you for this extremely rich talk. This is maybe an invitation to elaborate on your last point, the question of whether we can reject the these early childhood influences, or perhaps even know quite what those influences are. I was struck by, I suppose, all the temporal layers as well in your talk. So this is a book, this is a discarded library book from 1925. So I'm wondering if, as a child, you feel that you were aware of this temporal distance that was already there, the fact that encyclopedias are designed to be updated, and that there's already this sense of, is there already a sense of kind of an obsolescence of knowledge there? So the sense of distance, but also from a certain state of knowledge, perhaps? Is this something you feel you were aware of at the time?
Absolutely and equivocally not.
Mm.
I had no idea whatsoever that the entire book had not been written by Arthur Mee from beginning to end, that Arthur Mee was somewhere floating around as a benign presence in the universe. I think expecting historical consciousness from a 10-year-old is a stretch.
Perhaps I'm thinking more of the way in which these temporal layers are built into your talk now, right? The way in which it's very hard to perhaps discern, looking back now, to discern the ways in which these influences might still be there, right? Or that we can now separate out these stages that are there. I think maybe you'll...
Matt, why don't you...
Okay. Thank you. Well, I was... This may be too open-ended a question. I was struck by the fact that you presented your talk today as an essay and autobiography, but that in a way the object, rather than the subject, was the primary focus. We hear more about the encyclopedia than we do about you and your life, although we hear a bit. And I, having been an avid reader of your autobiographical volumes, although it feels a little funny to confess that now with you sitting there, I don't know, I was struck that, I mean, there's a kind of ongoing reflection, there must be, on what autobiography is and can do in various kind of formal choices that you make. If I remember, the earlier volumes of the autobiography are in the third person, and then the most recent one is, the conceit is that it's conducted by a researcher or something. And so I wanted to ask you in an open-ended way if you could talk about how you are thinking of the kinds of things that autobiography can do. Perhaps this comes into contact with your last remark. I mean, why those particular forms, and what are you thinking of as kind of the kinds of projects that you're hoping autobiographical reflection can help with?
It's a complex question, and you may think it's complex, but I think it's even more complex than you may think. It may be useful to start with a rather simple collaborative book I published a few years ago, a book called The Good Story, which I co-wrote with Arabella Coetzee, in which I took up the question of the stories we tell ourselves, including the stories that very bad people tell themselves to make themselves feel better. The primary question in The Good Story is whether we can tell ourselves any story we wish. What are the constraints that make us tell a true story about ourselves as opposed to the kind of story that pleases us? And that, to me, is still an open question when I consider examples of people who have committed atrocious crimes and seem to be quite happy afterwards. So, to me, autobiography is not something that autobiographers do. It's something that all of us do all the time. constructing a history for ourselves and a sort of logic to our lives leading up to the present that enables us to survive and to an extent to be happy about ourselves. What I was presenting to you, I know I called it a project in autobiography, but I should perhaps have been more precise, call it a project, a prolegomena to a project in autobiography, and examining what kind of understanding one can have of one's past. The kind of understanding that I was exploring very much in this paper was a retrospective, analytical and historically based understanding.
We have some time for questions or from the audience. Tom, there's a mic going around if you...
John, at one point you said you did not think you were English as a child. So two questions occur to me. What did you think of yourself as? I mean, did you have a name for the category you belonged to? And how did other people see you? Do you have memories of people saying, oh, I know what you are. You are, and you fill in the blank.
Yeah.
I don't know what the answer would be.
Well, I come from a not unpopulated class in the old South Africa of people of wide ethnic origin who spoke English as a kind of lingua franca. The very fact that these people called themselves English-speaking South Africans indicates that they were at a loss for what to think of themselves as ethnically. I certainly didn't have a name for myself. And when I came up against real English people, that is to say, people who'd recently moved from the British Isles to South Africa, I was certainly categorized as an Afrikaner.
Please. No, you can't. Please do wait for 1 second. It's coming right around. I mean, you can, but please don't.
Thank you. I was wondering if you...
Would you stand up?
I'm sorry?
Thanks, that's great. Yeah, please.
Hi. I was wondering if you could wish that you had not grown up with the Children's Encyclopedia or that you had grown up with something else. Because obviously you are who you are, you're saying, in virtue of having grown up with those stories. And if you hadn't, you might be free of certain things, but you might be missing certain things also. So yes, two questions. One, do you wish that you had not grown up with the Children's Encyclopedia? And if not that, what instead?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question as a sort of philosophical question, but it's an ahistorical question. If there had not been a Children's Encyclopedia, there would have been something very much like it. There wouldn't have been a hole, an absence. Something would have filled it. And what filled it would have been probably very like it.
I suppose I was thinking, I don't know,
Thanks.
just Shakespearean stories or classic books or Charles Lamb or something that wasn't a textbook, I suppose.
Yeah.
But I mean, I believe that the question is not coherent.
Yes, sir.
I was wondering, the character of the boy David in your last novels, Childhood and School Days of Jesus, he asks confounding questions which are absurd and whimsical. And I was wondering, it put me in the mind of the character, and how important was the role of whimsy and unreason in the Children's Encyclopedia?
Thank you.
Whimsy and unreason. I would say, I mean, without checking, I would say rather slight. I think someone like Lewis Carroll, for example, would have been too complicated for Arthur Nee. It was a very simple and very direct and I think very uninteresting person.
Carla, you had your hand up? Yeah. Thank you.
I wanted to know if there's something you would like to add on your reason to leave South Africa, or maybe it's explained there, and why you chose Australia.
I don't want to talk about that.
Okay.
Yes, Bellamy.
I wanted to return to the image of pre-verbal scribblings. And I had a question because your essay seems to scribble, rewrite lines through this text along three vectors: sex, racialization, and self-sacrifice or something. And I had two questions about that. One is why those three paths for rewriting besides their present urgency? You know, how did those come to you? How do you see those anchored in your autobiography? And that leads me to my second question, which is, why are the first two less present to you than self-sacrifice? And how do you identify the urgency of those particular lines of rewriting?
Yeah. To an extent, the project is a Proustian one. That is to say, it's an attempt to recover a child's reading, to recover an innocent reading, to recover exactly the kind of the opposite of the kind of reading that I've been doing here when I was talking about race and sex. And that, I was very interested, looking through and rereading these 10 volumes. In the cropping up, so to speak, out of nothing of moments like that. But they didn't often occur. In fact, the principal occurrence came with the last illustration I showed here, the picture of Jack Cornwall, where all of a sudden, in that strange headgear that Jack Cornwall is wearing, which is, I presume, meant to shield the ears from the noise of the gun going off, I seem to be seeing it for a moment through a child's eyes again, and to be experiencing the same sort of totally uncritical hero worship of this 16-year-old boy who, as far as, as one can objectively judge, did no good at all. His gun having been put out of operation right at the beginning. So that was what I was trying to do and largely failing to do because it's very difficult. It may be difficult, may be easier for other people with another kind of mind and another kind of temperament, but I found it very hard to recover a child's reading. But I tried.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you. It's a question also about self-sacrifice. Fully take your point about the boy where there is an anti-imperialist story to tell about his death. But in the long list of examples you gave, maybe some other characters died for worthier causes. So I want to ask you if you could talk a bit more about your ambivalence towards the idea or the value of self-sacrifice, and whether it's mainly a question of the cause that one dies for, or whether there is a larger point to be made about the very idea of sacrificing your life for any cause. Thank you.
Yeah. The point I primarily want to make is that preaching that particular doctrine to small children is, I would say, criminal. You can, by all means, as an adult, decide to sacrifice yourself for a cause that you, in a considered way, regard as worthy. But to inculcate in a child the notion that that the best thing the child can do with his life is throw it away is culpable.
Brenda, we're going to have the last question. Brenda, do you want to do that? Take it right now. Last comment.
I had the Book of Knowledge as a child, and we're only a year apart. And I would question whether the English colonial attitudes that the Children's Encyclopedia perpetuated are really the whole analysis of what those books were like, because I would argue that I had the same kinds of influences growing up in the United States, in Oklahoma, that you had in South Africa. I recognize you, and the self-sacrifice at the end seems perfectly reasonable in retrospect, but I'd never thought about it until now. So I'm asking you if there's something more universal in the kind of childhood that we peculiarly shared.
You mean we, as children of our era, shared?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, exactly.
Yes. Well, if just before I try to answer that question, a quick background. If I were doing a serious sociological study, for which this is really just a sketch, I would look at the American edition, because I think quite a lot got changed. For example, I know that British locomotives were replaced with American locomotives, that sort of thing. So I haven't investigated the Lear Book of Knowledge at all. All I know is that it was, as you attest, very widely distributed. What I would say about children of our era is that World War I cast a long shadow, and that although we, as children of World War II, or children born during World War II, were you, yes, might have thought that that was, the operative war in our lives. The devastation to the intellectual class that occurred in World War I casts a long shadow over literary production for decades thereafter. And I think as children, that is what we experienced.
I want to say one quick announcement, to say please stay for a reception. There's going to be food and drink. There is food and drink out back and on the side. Those of you who might want, the Seminary Co-op has a book stall there. So these are just organizing announcements. But really what I want to ask you to do is join me in thanking John so much for this.